make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
I also call it a godless constitution in the book, that the founders were very explicit and very intentional about not including language about God or Jesus in the Constitution. There were people who wanted them to, and they chose not to. So what I argue in the book was that this was really a pragmatic choice, that they had a shared assumption that mainstream Protestantism was going to rule the day. But they didn't want to have a debate between Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Anglicans.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. What's going on, Josh?
Doing good. Well, when you say the watchers, is that do you think you say that because of isn't the watchers, isn't that Marvel?
It is a Marvel.
Because I always think viewers, but then watchers, doesn't it feel like people in the watchtower just watching?
It is.
Anyway, I always think of that, and I had to bring it in this time. So, Matt, you're welcome. This is the one where I had to bring in that.
We talked about this, Josh. No interruptions during the introduction. No interruption. Anyways, we're joined today.
Well, so I'm gonna interrupt you too. I've also been telling people I'm taping a podcast and realized taping is not quite the right word anymore. I don't think.
That's true.
It's like rolling up the window. I said that to my kid the other day. They're like,
what?
Roll what? What are you talking about?
How do you roll windows? Sorry.
Yeah. So. Now that the podcast has completely gone off the rails, we have joining us today Matt Avery Sutton, who is a historian and an author of a new book called Chosen Land, Christianity and American History. He is a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of History at Washington State University, earned his PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and has written a ton of other stuff as well. And we are just so glad to have him here with us today. So welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks so much. It's so much fun to be here with you guys.
Yeah. And so I want to start off first by just being upfront and honest. So on our show, we talk to a lot of authors, a lot of really smart people. Publishers will send us books. We'll read them, most of them, and then ask questions. But your book is a little bit different because I intentionally sought out a book of yours called American Apocalypse that you wrote, and just fell in love with it because it's just so I don't know, your writing style just resonates with me personally. And I just wanted to know more. So I reached out to you to say, hey, I want to know more about premillennialism. and you responded back, yeah, sure. Also, I got a new book. And I'm like, oh, man, that's awesome. And I got a free book out of the email. And it's an amazing book. Chosen Land.
Can't beat that.
Is a phenomenal book. It's long, too. It's huge.
It's also, it works as a paperweight if you need one.
Or a weapon, Yeah,
I was going to say a weapon. That's so funny.
So what is this book, Chosen Land? Kind of give us sort of the high-level core thesis of this book. Why did you write it?
Yeah, so in 650 pages, essentially I was trying to understand how and why Americans are so religious. We know we are one of the most religious nations in the world in terms of leading, wealthy, industrialized, powerful nations. We're very different than our friends in Canada, or many folks in Western Europe. And so the question for me was why? What's different? How is that? And especially when we have one of the most secular constitutions in kind of the modern era. And so this is a long journey to try to answer that question that begins with Columbus and ends with President Trump's 2024 inauguration.
I love that. And so it's amazing that we can see a through line in terms of Christianity and its influence. And it is, I think this is, I definitely have a question about this arc, this through line that I want to hear from you. But I think this whole conversation will get to the uncomfortable feeling that many people have that's yes, we're not a Christian nation. Like people like me, I guess. Yes, we're not a Christian nation because I can't say. But on the same hand, we kind of are. And then it feels like we're kind of not. And it feels like we kind of are. And it just kind of feels like it's very, very confusing. No one could accuse us of being, say, a Muslim nation or a Hindu nation or even even an atheist or even a secular nation vis-a-vis like, I don't know, Europe or something. So what is this through line that you see in Christianity in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I even remember in high school being a little bit of a cynic of the language of Christian nation. Like, would Jesus identify a nation as Christian? Like, how does a nation convert from not Christian to Christian? Like, it's not really an application to a nation state. But certainly in terms of the majority of Americans, when they're asked what are their religious preferences or their religious identity, it's still majority Christian. And so in that sense, the American people themselves identify as more Christian than folks in many other parts in the world. And again, not in some parts of Africa, some parts of Latin America, but certainly relative to Western Europe and Canada, that there's just a lot more Christianity. And then the other part of what I'm trying to do in the book was to show why it actually matters. Like, who cares if you identify as Christian or not, if you keep your Christianity kind of to yourself? But Americans don't do that. The American Christians have worked really, really hard to influence the trajectory of the nation, and they don't always agree on what that trajectory should be. But Christianity is so much a part of our society, our culture, our media, our foreign policy, our laws, our traditions, that it's just really unavoidable. And it so saturates our lives that we often don't even see it because it's just the air we breathe.
You know, I want to start at the beginning with Christopher Columbus, because reading your book, I learned some things about Christopher Columbus that I did not know. And I was kind of joking with Josh before we were recording. I was like, oh man, I think Christopher Columbus may have been a Christian nationalist, like using our current, sort of like labels for past, discretions or whatever. But I'd love for you just to unpack sort of the Christopher Columbus story, maybe the Christopher Columbus story that people didn't hear in high school.
Yeah, and I didn't hear it either. What I found useful about beginning with Columbus is that when he launched his ships thinking he was going to find China, the reason he thought he was going to find China was because he thought he was going to find riches, and then he was going to use those riches to help Spain in its conquest for the Holy Land, basically to fund the Crusades. And so he was actually a real student of biblical prophecy and really obsessed with it. And so he thought this was part of God's end times, last days plan to help finance the Crusades, to help finance the reclamation of the Holy Land. And so it kind of starts off this story by recognizing that, from the very beginning of the European encounter of North America, there was this sense of divine destiny, this sense of, God's will, of God's providence. And then, of course, it evolves and changes over time. Now, I do want to jump in on the question of Christian nationalism. One thing that has frustrated me as a historian is the way that term has come up so recently and become so useful. And it really is a term that sociologists resurrected in around 2020, 2021, if I get my dates right. But I think if we define it carefully, many Americans could fall into the category of Christian nationalists if we simply are talking about trying to influence the nation on the basis of their religious beliefs. And so Martin Luther King is very much a Christian nationalist, Christopher Columbus, Jerry Falwell. But, if you're a Christian and you're trying to influence society, I guess that makes you a Christian nationalist.
Just real fast, because this is one of the things I think I love about your book, is that there's almost like nothing that you see about Christianity today that you can't point to like another point in time, like in history, where it's like, I mean, I suppose that's probably why you got into history, right? But it's like on the Christian nationalism thing, I did a bunch of research on this because I just wrote a Substack about it. We've been doing this podcast for 6 years. We talked to a lot of the experts about Christian nationalism, the Sam Perrys and the Whiteheads of the world, and the Stephen Wolfs who wrote the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And I'm like, I really just want to write something, but I just didn't want to write something like that came from a place of not being informed. So I went on this quest to just reread all these books, wrote something. But in my quest, I came to learn that Christian nationalism, like there was a Christian nationalist party, like in the country. Can you tell us about that just a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, there have been a number of different groups that have tried to create kind of Christian-oriented political parties. They've also focused on particular issues, like single issues, like updating the Constitution to acknowledge God, and in some cases to acknowledge Jesus. And so, yeah, we've seen throughout American history this kind of ebb and flow of trying to make Christianity more explicitly part of our politics. And that is really why I love history. That, when I teach my first-year students, and usually I just teach kind of general U.S. history. I do teach U.S. religious history, but not as often. But for them, I explain to them history matters. Like, if they want to understand the world they're living in today, they really need to understand the past. And so part of what I try to do in my books is to try to make what's happening today make sense to a larger audience, and to recognize that, yeah, there are things happening today that are very different and are very unique, both really good and really bad. But there's also a lot of things that have kind of happened before and that we can learn from, and that we can kind of see the trajectories. And in some ways that gives me some peace when I get kind of anxious about everything happening around me, to realize that, the country has made it through some of these things in the past, and that there can still be some hope for the future. But back to, where you began on my book, American Apocalypse. One of the great things about studying the apocalyptic strain in American history is you recognize every generation thinks they're living at the end. And so it brings me a little comfort. I have a buddy who's constantly sending me articles about AI and how AI is just going to destroy us all. And maybe, sooner or later, the apocalypse is going to happen. But I also realize how many times previously we've been afraid that some new technology was going to destroy the world.
Yes, it's a common fear. And, I absolutely love talking to historians, Matt, for the exact reason that you just said. They just have a really high BS detector because they've seen these patterns before. You know what I mean? Like, they know that when someone says something in an oversimplification of something in history, like, yeah, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. They've exposed it already, because any historian already knows history's so freaking complicated, and you're trying to understand it, and you're selecting things, and you have methodologies. You're not getting something down from heaven telling you this is exactly what happened. You're trying to figure it out, what happened, and trying to understand it. And I love that about history and historians. And when you're talking about the claim in the book that you're making that Christianity is not just like a side actor in any way, right? It is a main driving engine. And we had someone come on the podcast that wrote a book called The Godless Constitution. And that was one of those things, right, where there was a very intentional way that the Constitution didn't include, say, what might have been in the Articles of Confederation of attributing something to God, or even in some of the constitutions of the colonies that even had explicitly, some of them, right, Christian messaging of bringing the gospel and spreading it through like this movement. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that. That's just my understanding. And so we have this arc, but you're arguing, right, again, that even with a godless constitution, quote unquote, and I mean, God, the name God isn't in the Constitution, not that it's some godless document, so anyway, people they never understand what you're saying. Anyway, so sorry, here's the question. Why is it a dominant engine? What's your case that it actually has been a dominant engine that shapes law, policy, entertainment, all that kind of stuff? Because it kind of feels like, to me, that's what I've heard. I've heard the opposite of that.
Yeah, so I 100% agree with the way you set up the question, the way you framed it. I also call it a godless constitution in the book, that the founders were very explicit and very intentional about not including language about God or Jesus in the Constitution. There were people who wanted them to, and they chose not to. So what I argue in the book was that this was really a pragmatic choice, that they had a shared assumption that mainstream Protestantism was going to rule the day, but they didn't want to have a debate between Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Anglicans. And so to alleviate those kind of things in really centuries of warfare in Europe among different sects of Christianity, they thought, we're going to keep this as neutral as possible. And then what they do is, as you well know, is craft a First Amendment that says there's going to be no establishment of religion and no prohibition of the free exercise thereof. And what that does is opens a door in ways they didn't anticipate. And then this becomes another major theme of the book. And what it does is it puts the onus on the Christian leaders, the religious leaders, to make the case for themselves that the Christian people, or not the Christian people, the American people need to become Christians and need to follow them. Because if they can't attract a following, they're not going to be able to keep the lights on. They're not going to be able to keep the doors open. They're not going to be able to keep their churches in business. And so what they do is they come up with really creative, innovative, entrepreneurial ways to make Christianity attractive. And so every single generation, we can see Christianity is presented in a new way, and it's made relevant. And so if you're in the UK and you have an established church, or you're in Germany, you have an established church, you don't really have to worry about losing your funding. Like if you're a minister, you've got a salary, it's paid for by tax dollars. Children are going to schools where they're being inculcated in that faith. If you're in the United States, people can choose any kind of entertainment they want. They can do anything they want on a Sunday morning or on a Wednesday evening. And so you have to make Christianity attractive. And so what it does is it fosters this real creativity and excitement, and it makes the faith interesting. And so what it does is then makes it attractive. And part of that then means it's going to have influence. And so it allows Christian leaders to recognize that if they want to grow their influence, if they want to have influence, it makes sense for them to partner with political leaders, with social leaders, with economic leaders, because that's what's going to help draw people into their doors. The last thing, I feel like I'm going on and on and on, but the last part of this, though, is... No,
you're not at all, by the way. I'm loving all of this. I hope what I did, I looked down, I hope that didn't send the wrong message. Love what you're talking about. Okay.
The other thing that I tried to do in the book, though, is show, of course, that there are many versions of Christianity. And so there's kind of the dominant Christian leaders, the mainstream folks, and who is mainstream changes a little bit over time. But there's the mainstream folks, and then there's those marginal folks who are always punching up, who are always hitting back, who are always trying to do something different. And I give different labels for these groups to try to make sense of them. But one of them is the liberationist stream. And they're the ones who are always out of power. They're the ones who say this is not a Christian nation. If it was a Christian nation, it would be practicing justice. It would be practicing equality. It would be practicing inclusion. They're saying there's nothing Christian about this nation at all. And so they're pushing against the paradigm, but they're still using Christianity to do it. They're still true believers. They're still, showing up at their churches on Sunday morning. It's just their churches are offering a different message and a different vision for the nation and a different vision for its future.
In the book, you talk about sort of like these different frameworks, and I think you were kind of alluding a little bit to it. Can you just like break down? I can't remember. There's like 4 different frameworks that you've got. Like, kind of help us think about like the structure of those frameworks and how they're used and thought about.
Yeah, so the liberationists are the ones I mentioned. They're the ones who are going to always be on the outside. They're always the marginal ones. So it's indigenous leaders in the colonial era who are adopting Christianity, but then using it to say, this looks like a language of freedom and language of equality. Why are we not being respected? And then it moves into both the enslaved as well as other black leaders in the 19th century, abolitionists who again are part of this liberationist tradition. Then into the 20th century, it tends to be folks who are organizing the poor, who are on the margins. And again, it's always in the language of Christianity. They're not rejecting Christianity, they're reinterpreting it. The group that often has the power shifts, but the other groups are the liberals, who are the folks who think about how to accommodate Christianity to contemporary trends. And everybody's always adopting Christianity to contemporary trends, but they're the ones who are more explicit about thinking about what's happening in science, what's happening kind of among intellectuals. So they're going to modify and they're going to adapt as, ideas of Darwinian evolution change, or as literary criticism forces us to think about the authorship of different parts of the Bible. Then there are the conservatives. And those are the folks who really emphasize tradition in the church community. And so they're they want to conserve the old faith. They really believe in creeds. They think they should be really careful about changing or modifying the faith. And again, they do it, but they do it much more slowly and much more cautiously. So like Catholics are often in this tradition that they're, they're Christians, but they're not going to move real fast. Ethnic congregations in the 19th century, if you're a bunch of German Lutherans, you're not really going to modify with the times as much as some other groups. And then the last group are the revivalists. these are the folks who really focus on the individual. They use the language of being born again or having a relationship with Jesus Christ. They really focus on individual conversion. For them, you're not born into Lutheranism or you're not born into Christianity. You have to make that choice. You have to convert no matter who you are or where you are. They don't care much about creeds. They would say they care about church community and the body of Christ, but they're the church shoppers. They're the ones who are going to go from place to place to place, focusing on what their individual needs are. And so they emphasize revivalism as this emotional experience. And so we can see all these threads kind of play out in different ways across U.S. history.
I think that's so freaking interesting. And, thinking about this claim that I think it's worth repeating the idea that the separation of church and state, right, which is often used to show how secular America is. Your argument is that it didn't actually secularize America. It supercharged religious power. Essentially, it created an environment, right, where competition created innovation. It created a need for mass appeal. It created a need to get money. And so innovation, driving, effort, all that stuff, maybe salesmanship, passion, all that created this like supercharged environment where religion was spreading. Is that accurate, basically, of like? That's
exactly right. And the part I forgot to mention is also media. This is why religious leaders are often the pioneers at adopting new forms of media, and they excel at it, whether it was radio in the 1920s, print media, like developing Bible tracts in the 1830s.
Yes.
Then, of course, the 1950s, it's Fulton Sheen, the Catholic leader, Billy Graham, both on television. So, and then, of course, with the internet now. So, yeah, so media also becomes essential.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's a key observation, and that's the same thing today, right? I mean, you see Christians, they're trying to be on the cutting edge of all sorts of things to get this message out, any social media platform, any kind of technology that's communicative, right, in its nature. Christians are going to try to, because it's a missionary religion, or at least certain aspects, right, of Christianity, or certain traditions. Really play up that missionary part. But I think another interesting thing here I want to focus in on is the idea that this playing field was not actually neutral. So again, a lot of people, when they think like religious freedom, like the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and the First Amendment, that's essentially they're using, or then Thomas Jefferson's letter to Danbury Baptists about there's a wall of separation, right? So people look at that and they think, hey, look, that meant from the beginning, Muslims, Jews, atheists, Hindus, anyone, right? Look, they said there's no religious test, right? That's what it says. So therefore, it was always pure religious freedom from the beginning, which you kind of challenge a little bit. It seems like it was rigged towards mainstream Protestants. Can you kind of like help us understand that idea that there wasn't this neutral playing field, that really was Protestant Christianity that was maybe unofficial? What was unofficially favored? How would you help us understand that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's what I call it in the book, the unofficial Protestant establishment. They're the folks who have power. And there's debate. Certainly Jefferson believed in religious freedom as you would describe it today, like separation of church and state is how we think about it. But he was very much in the minority. The vast majority of the founders assumed and expected and wrote about mainstream Christianity ruling the country. And if you were Jewish, if you were Muslim, you couldn't be an atheist or an agnostic and run for office. I mean, it didn't work in the 19th century. You couldn't be a Latter-day Saint who wanted to practice polygamy, no matter how much that was your sincerely held belief. You couldn't be a member of the United community, disavowing traditional marriage. You couldn't be, a member of the Society of Universal Friends. I mean, there were lots of ways you were persecuted if you were outside the religious minority, even if you were a Christian outside of the religious majority, and then certainly if you were practicing a non-Christian faith. And so what I try to show in the book is that the language of separation of church and state, this idea of high wall that Jefferson wrote about in that letter to the Danbury Baptists, isn't really applied by the courts until the 1940s, until the Everson decision in 1947. And so this is one area where, the folks today that you would call Christian nationalists who say, this should be a Christian country and, we should have laws that reflect Christian ideas. in fact, they can make a good argument that in the 19th century, that is the nation we lived in, that those who violated mainstream Christian laws were persecuted, including even Catholics. So I would argue that the Everson decision is the future I want to see this country have. But so Neil Gorsuch and other members of the Supreme Court are on solid ground when they say, no, in the 19th century, we should have football coaches in high schools allowed to pray on the center of the football field, because through most of our history, we thought that was just fine. And so these kinds of debates that are coming up now, funding of religious charter schools in the 19th century, that would have been just fine. And so the question really becomes, what nation do we want to be going forward? Not what nation were we in the past, or those of us who want to defend true separation of church and state, we're going to lose that argument in terms of history.
Yeah, because we're all real quick, because we're trying to bring out this idealized form of it's like I see this in the church all the time. Hey, remember the early church? Well, the early church, do you remember all the letters that got written to the early church because they were so freaking messed up and they couldn't get anything right? So again, but we idealize, right? That's where the historian comes in. Oh, wait, do you guys remember that there was all sorts of craziness happen and this is what that meant and all that? And we get trapped in this ideal, and you're focusing in on, and in my opinion, is the most important question. It's not what kind of country we were; it's what kind of country we want to be.
Yeah.
And that is the question, because it doesn't matter in some sense. It matters for historical understanding and precedent to understand what the Constitution meant in 1776. Same way it matters what Jesus meant in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, right? When he says, blessed are the peacemakers, right? For, they'll see God or whatever. I'm probably butchering that one because I'm forgetting, but blessed are the peacemakers. I know that. But so what do we have to do? We have to understand that first, not because we're going to apply it like a first century person would, but because we're going to take the principles and bring it here. And that seems to me how you interpret anything of history or a constitution. But now we've gone to this place where, I don't know, we're all trying to grasp at some America that really never existed, or maybe existed at some level in its past and is now shifted. Anyway.
Yeah, no, and I think just being honest about our past, good, bad, and otherwise. I mean, and that's again how I began my class with my students, especially since history has become so controversial in this kind of in this era, is to tell them I'm so grateful and so thankful that I was born and raised in the United States, but the country's not perfect. Like, let's learn from the past so we can make it better in the future. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging those mistakes. And I think it's a similar thing when we think about separation of church and state, that that we haven't been perfect, and it's better to acknowledge that than to pretend like what Jefferson wrote in 1802 was, the law of the land ever since, because it just simply wasn't.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question that I've been dying to ask you since I read American Apocalypse, and that's about premillennialism. And the question will be two-part. One, it's like, what is premillennialism? And then two, kind of place it in sort of the broader context of your book, because you mentioned earlier about Christopher Columbus, being somewhat of an expert of end times ideas or whatnot. And based on my understanding of premillennialism, that's tied to that somewhat. So I'd love for you just to kind of, define what premillennialism is, and then what's the through line kind of through the course of history, amongst Christians.
So Christians have always debated how to understand the book of Revelation and some other passages in Matthew, and also then back to Daniel and Ezekiel, and sort of what's coming next. Like, where are we in scope of Christian history, the biblical timeline, and where are we going? And historically, and this is beyond the boundaries of the United States, just kind of within broader church history, there have been some debates about what is described in the book of Revelation as the coming millennium, this 1,000 years of peace and prosperity for humankind, for the earth. And what Christians have disagreed on, and there's lots of nuances here, but kind of the big overview is, are we going to build that millennium ourselves? Are Christians going to establish the kingdom of God on earth, that we're going to slowly move towards creating a perfect society, and then we're going to have this amazing 1,000 years of prosperity, and then Jesus is going to return at the end of that? Or is there going to be a rupture in time where Jesus is going to return, the second coming is going to happen, and only after that will we have peace and prosperity, because he is going to kind of break the world as we know it and then rebuild it. And so the themes have varied throughout American history, but throughout much of the late 18th, early 19th century, the vast majority of American Christians were what were called postmillennialists. They believed they were building the kingdom of God on earth. And so this inspired a lot of reform, missionary movements, because you needed to get the gospel spread as broadly as you could, as quickly as possible. It also, inspired folks to move for, building the case for human rights, for prohibiting consumption of alcohol, for lots of different things that they thought were part of building kingdom of God. But in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, really through much of the rest of the 20th century, we see a revival of this premillennialist idea, which is the sense that we're moving towards this rupture in time. We're moving towards the apocalypse, towards the Battle of Armageddon, which is again described in the book of Revelation. And so for these Christians, they believe that the clock is ticking and time is running out. And so the old arguments by historians and others were that if you believe Jesus was coming at any moment, it would lead to despair, that you would essentially, climb the mountains, sell your houses, quit your jobs because you're just going to wait for Jesus to come back. And what I discovered by actually listening to these people themselves, by reading their sermons, looking at their books, their diaries, their letters, that instead of encouraging indifference, what it did was it encouraged them to be more active and more engaged and more involved because they had such a sense that time was running out and that Jesus was going to come back and judge them and separate the sheep from the goats, that they needed to be they needed to be ready, and they needed to use the talents that Jesus had given them to maximum effect. And so what happens throughout the 20th century is the most ardent premillennialists. They're the ones who lay the foundation for what we call fundamentalism, and then for what we think of as post-war evangelicalism for the Billy Grahams and the Jerry Falwells of the world. They become very involved and very engaged in politics because they recognize that when Jesus comes back to judge individuals and to judge nations, he is going to judge the United States based on how godly or godless it is. And so they believe that there's nothing wrong, that in fact it's righteous for them to try to institute their vision of Christianity on the country because the apocalypse is coming, and they want to position the U.S. on the right side of that historical event.
I mean, it just shows you how much theology matters for people. It's like we ignore theology at our own peril, sociologically, I think, because politicians don't ignore theology, by the way. Scientists ignore theology. Sociologists might not ignore theology because they have to think about it. But it's like when we ignore theology, we ignore a very strong, widespread, fundamental driver for people's behavior. And because it's ignoring beliefs. It's theology makes it sound like it's up here and all abstract. It's ignoring people's beliefs, their fundamental ways of viewing the world. And those drive behavior all the time, right? Plus incentives. And it's like, this conversation is so fascinating, and it's so important for everyone to have, because again, I think what we have is we have two people saying two things that are true at the same time. One group is saying we're not a Christian nation, and then they're thinking about the jurisprudence that's happened since the beginning of the 19th or 20th century up to now, right? The things that happened, the way that they were taught, how they brought, and then you have another group that says we are, and they can actually make a pretty good case contextually at the time that most people would have considered us a Christian nation that lived in here, right? Even the writers of the Constitution itself, right, which is part of the case that you're making. And so we have two things at the same time. And they're just in different periods of history, why it's important to know history, by the way, because then we flatten everything and we miss things. But Christianity isn't background culture, right? It's an organizing logic behind America. And I would really, how does this interact with pluralism? Like, I just would love for you to kind of dig into that a little bit more. Like it's not this background thing. It is this organizing structure that's driven so much of America.
Yeah.
How does that interact with pluralism?
Yeah, and back to where you started, it's not fashionable anymore to identify as an intellectual historian, but I very much was trained that way, and I do love ideas, and this is of course the challenge that when we talk about premillennialism or postmillennialism, I wonder, Josh, if I polled your church, like how many folks in the pews could explain to me the difference between premillennialism and postmillennialism, but they've probably all heard of the rapture. Yeah, and
one of them's me, I think.
Yeah, and they might be eagerly anticipating the rapture, which is a word that's not in the Bible, but like there's certain ideas that have come to be identified with Christian groups, but it gets really messy in terms of like where the ideas fit. But to your question about pluralism, I think the issue is for me to recognize that people of faith are going to want their faith to influence where their cultures and their country and their politics and their laws. And I think that's okay. I don't think it's right for us to ask anybody to, quench their faith, to act like their faith shouldn't influence their public lives. So the question, though, becomes not like, should your faith be driving this? The question is like, what is the policy you want? And does that policy best serve our nation? So if we're talking about gay rights, if we're talking about access to abortion, it doesn't matter if your vision is driven by your Christian faith or your Muslim faith or your Jewish faith. The question really is, what is best for our collective whole going forward for our nation? And that's where I make the argument for pluralism, because I want everybody at the table, and I want everybody to feel free to talk about how their faith influences their ideas. But that can't be the basis for making law. The basis for making law is what's going to serve the greatest good. And the last thing, and I'll shut up, but the key that I found, when we talk about 19th century ideas of Christian America, is to always remember, for me, that there's always a minority who are saying Christian for who? They're the ones who are looking at injustice, who are looking at Jim Crow, who are looking at slavery, who are looking at persecution of minorities, who are looking at what's happening on Indian reservations. And they're the ones saying, what kind of Christianity is this? This is a joke. This is a farce. And so, even among Christians, there is a debate about what it means to be a Christian nation at every moment in our time, every moment in our history.
One thing your book does really well that I think a few books, at least that I've read, I'm sure there's probably other books out there that do this well. Like Kevin Kruse's book, One Nation Under God, I think does a pretty good job, like sort of showing the business case of sort of Christianity in America. But your book is much more comprehensive, spans a couple hundred years. And I'm curious, like, what are a couple different inflection points that you saw where either, I don't know, Christianity had an oversized influence on politics, or politics had an oversized influence on religion? Yeah.
So Kevin is a Kansas City Chiefs fan. So if you want to also say that my book is better, not just more comprehensive, that would be fine too. But yeah, the business side is fun because it's fun for me. I guess what I find fun is probably not what everybody finds fun. But to think about the role of capitalism and of business in the U.S., and again, this in part comes back to the disestablishment clause that if you're not being funded by tax dollars, you've got to find money. And so Christian leaders build relationships with lots of powerful people, essentially because they have to. And one of, I think, the misconceptions in recent years is this idea that, the religious right is in the pockets of corporations. They may well be, but the religious left also takes a whole lot of money from a whole lot of corporations and a whole lot of trusts. And so, especially over the course of the early to mid 20th century, which is the period that Kevin talks about, and Kevin writes about this as well, that he gets this right. The evangelicals, the rise of kind of the early Billy Grahams, they are being funded by these libertarian businessmen, people like J. Howard Pugh. But simultaneously, the religious liberals are being funded by the Rockefellers and getting it's oil money versus oil money driving these two different visions of Christianity. And then there are always, again, the folks on the outside, people like Catholic radical Dorothy Day, who are saying, what about the poor? What about the dispossessed? There are some social gospel leaders who are saying we shouldn't take this money. This is tainted money. This is dirty money. But it's really hard to do because you need money. And so there's this debate about whether or not you should take money that's being raised by these corporate barons. And the debates are happening among all of the different Christian groups. But yeah, you can't separate money from the way Christianity unfolds in this country because of the disestablishment clause. And so that also means that the radicals who really want to overthrow capitalism always have a hard time. They're, the socialist organizers, the labor organizers, because to do that, they're not just going against outside capital, but they're often going against the capital that's funding their own churches. And so one of the favorite things I found in the archives was the story by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who's this minister, really prominent minister in Manhattan in the 1920s. John D. Rockefeller Jr. builds a church for him. He helps fund Union Theological Seminary. He's real influential in liberal Christianity. And at one point, Rockefeller criticizes him, sends him a letter for criticizing corporate leaders. In the way Fosdick folds, it was kind of embarrassing to read because he immediately recognizes that, he's this paragon of liberal Christianity. But as soon as John D. Rockefeller says, hey, don't push that hard, he just caves. I think in the original draft of the book, I talked about, return to the requisite ass kissing. And I think my editor took out the language of ass kissing. But my point was that they all have to do it. And so we know Billy Graham does it because Billy Graham does it very overtly and very obviously, but the liberals are doing the same thing.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And it's just being human. We all want to hide our humanity, the bad parts of it, and then kind of amplify the bad parts of the other, our opponents. And we're all just humans, we're trying to figure this out. And thinking about the pluralism issue, and again, thinking about the idea of it's like we have a pluralism, and for most maybe, and let me know if this is right, there's almost been a canopy, pluralism under a canopy of Protestantism. Yeah. Right. So yes, pluralism, but really it's Protestantism is the king, and then all the other ones, they can exist, but it essentially is that they're inferior, right? And then and essentially that Protestant idioms, terms, ideas, concepts, they're kind of setting the terms for American debate, American life, public life. Even thinking about a term like evangelical, which is this is leading to my question about thinking about how, right, it's almost like a constrained pluralism. And we're trying to bring an unconstrained pluralism that a lot of people might be scared of because of these ideas. They don't know where they're going to go. How has evangelicalism, what part has that played in this? And even the term itself, I know you spent some time on kind of debunking maybe some of the ideas around that term. I'd love for you to help us understand evangelicalism and how this sets the terms or has influenced the way that we debate and talk and work in public life. So, yeah, the evangelical question, the term itself has been used by so many different groups in so many different ways, dating really back to the Reformation. And so there's versions of it in, many different languages. And so I don't use the term until we get to 1942 with the rise of the National Association of Evangelicals. And it's not that it wasn't used in the 19th century, it was, but it was just used so differently that I found that I would confuse my readers more than help them if I used the term the way people in the 19th century used it. I could then say, well, when they say evangelicals, they're really sometimes talking about Unitarians, and sometimes they're talking about Quakers, groups that today we would say those aren't evangelicals, those are their own thing. And so just to avoid having to always qualify it, I just thought it was simpler to use a term like revivalist that talks about kind of the practices without getting stuck on the, capital E evangelical. But 1942, a group of self-identified fundamentalists realized that the term fundamentalism has lost cultural cachet. It's become a little bit of an embarrassment, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But it was really the media misused the term and turned it into a disparaging kind of way to paint lots of people they didn't like as ignorant, as Southern, as rural, as uneducated. And so it took on all these connotations that had nothing to do with the group that actually gave birth to it. And so for these folks, they're recognizing, we need to rebrand.
And so what they do is what makes sense, which is to go back to this historic term, evangelicalism. And so they adopt it. And the reason they're rebranding is they're trying to grow their influence in American society. And in 1942, the two things they're most interested in is access to the airwaves, like radio is exploding, and they want to make sure they can maintain their role in radio. In the federal government, the New Deal administration is beginning to regulate radio much more restrictively. And so they need to be able to lobby the government and make sure they can keep their radio stations. And the other thing is chaplains, right? This is World War II. And so they want to make sure that their people are being used as chaplains, but many of them don't have the kinds of credentials that the mainline churches ministers and chaplains have. And so they've got to make the case that they can send out their folks too, because they want to make sure that they're ministering to their people in the military. And so they create this lobby, and they're very explicit. This is not a church organization. It's not an evangelistic agency. It's not a missionary organization. Its purpose is to lobby the government. It's founded in Washington, D.C. It consists of Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, some Episcopalians, some Congregationalists, a lot of independent folks. And so they say, we're going to build this organization called the National Association of Evangelicals. And then from there, the move and the term evolves and kind of snowballs. So today, of course, it's pretty ubiquitous. We think of evangelicals as this large, broad group. And I actually am wondering, and Josh, you would be the guy to tell me this, but if evangelicals themselves, those self-identified evangelicals, are thinking again about rebranding because it's become so associated with Trump religious right that to say you're an to say that you're an evangelical means, you believe all these things that would be foreign to an evangelical in 1943 or even 1976, when Jimmy Carter would identify as an evangelical. And so the term itself, it gets really complicated.
It's so wild. Like I do know people that have chosen not to identify as evangelical, but still identify as Christian, which seems weird to me for some strange reason. But I want to ask you, looking at hundreds of years of American history with sort of the thread of Christianity, not all of it's bad. Right? I mean,
no, not at all.
there has to be some good nuggets, right? Like I'm a Christian, so I'm just like, did I just join a cult? So can you just draw out, give us some of the stories of this weaving of Christianity into American life, where it actually served a much broader, bigger purpose.
Absolutely, and again, this is where I love the liberationist tradition. They're the folks calling for justice. They're the ones calling for equality. And so, the easiest obvious example is Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was so driven by dedicated, devout Christian people that the Civil Rights Movement would have looked nothing like it looked without Christianity being central to it. But we can see this throughout. We can see it, with Black leaders fighting to overturn slavery. We can see it among the indigenous leaders fighting for indigenous rights. I talk in the book about Troy Perry and the rise of the Metropolitan Community Church in the 1970s. That's affirming of gay and lesbians and, defending gay marriage, same-sex marriage. So there's a deep Christian element to every kind of political tradition in the United States, whether progressive or conservative, whether liberal or not. And so the question is not, Christianity is good or Christianity is bad, but how is Christianity being used in that moment and for what kinds of things? And of course, there's a long Christian tradition of social gospel reform, of building hospitals, of creating, poverty relief. The New Deal, the social agencies of the New Deal that builds the modern welfare state were led by social gospelers. I mean, it was very Christian infused. And so there's all kinds of good. And so part of what I do as a historian is to counter the stereotype that you're raising, Will, that we have this idea, this Bill Maher idea that Christianity is just bad. It's just evil. Anytime Christianity gets involved in politics, it does bad things. And, as the historian, I'm like, no, it does both. And so we need to kind of think about the good and the bad and not look at Christianity as the cause of good or bad, but as how Christians use Christianity for good or for bad, because they did it both ways.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it again just reinforces the idea that history is complicated and people are complicated. Like, it's amazing to me that I can have the same basic, belief of as Jesus is Lord, as someone who might think very, very, very different from me on a lot of different issues, policy issues, which is strange, right? And it's almost like I would love for you to kind of bring out some of the ways that race and even gender and sexuality have basically been embedded in Christianity and almost created like coalitions around them throughout the history. Like what did race do? What did things, calls for justice, a lot of them around race, a lot of them now more recently around, well, I guess not in terms of gender, but sexuality, sexual identity, that kind of things, that kind of stuff, equality there. What's been the story of Christianity with that? Because especially there's so many people that are saying, we're the real Christians, they're the real Christians. And it's weird because it's like, yeah, how can I have this fundamental belief about Jesus and have so many different beliefs than someone else who says the same thing? It seems strange to me, but I wonder if historically what you found about that in the United States.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And one of the things I lay out in the book in the introduction is just the fact that we always have to be conscious to the issues of race and gender, sexuality, and also class, because all of those things are going to influence the way people read their Bibles. And it's not me saying that to like, you go to your average churchgoer and they think that they just read it objectively. And of course we all do. We all think we read whatever text we're reading objectively. But again, history is the easy tool to use to say, no, actually, if you are a white man in the 1930s, a premillennialist, to get back to Will's question about premillennialism, who believes the end is coming, and you're looking for signs that the Antichrist is emerging, if you're in the United States, your signs are abroad. You're looking at Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito and saying, like, the Antichrist is over there. That this is, like, we can see that these kind of global coalitions are building, and they're threatening the United States as a nation. If you're a black man living in the 1930s in Detroit and you're a Christian and you're looking for signs of the Antichrist, you're saying, these are right here. This is Jim Crow America. This is the fact that, if I was down south, I couldn't vote and I couldn't speak my mind, or I might be lynched. And so it's the same theology. It's premillennialism. It's looking for signs of the Antichrist. It's reading Daniel and Ezekiel and Matthew and Revelation the exact same way. But the signs that you see are going to be very, very different than if you are, based on your gender, race, class, social position. Then again, we see this very much with just simply class too, that somebody, in a downtrodden community that has suffered all kinds of economic hardship is going to see the way Jesus talks about the money changers very differently than somebody in Manhattan who works on Wall Street. Both might be Christians, both might read the same Bible, but they're going to have a very different understanding of what Jesus thinks about capitalism, about economics, and about what it means to care for the poor.
My last question to you is about ownership of Christianity. And I'm curious if there is a trend or any sort of pattern emerging from groups within the country that have wanted to kind of monopolize the faith. And, like we just using current events, you can just turn on the news and it's like Democrats can't be Christian, right? Or Christians can't vote for Democrats, So as a Christian Democrat, this is news to me. So I'm curious, are there other periods kind of in American history where folks have, tried to claim, Christianity is uniquely, a part of their belief or group?
Yeah, not in the ways that they have in recent eras, just because the nature of political parties were so different. And so it's really about what we think of as kind of modern political partisanship and the way that's evolved. And so one of my favorite sections in the book was writing about Barack Obama, because he was extraordinarily aware of this, because, when he's campaigning in 2008, there are folks who are saying, you're not, beyond just the birther nonsense. There are others who are just saying simply, you can't be a Christian because of the kind of values you espouse. And he's coming back and saying, no, you misunderstand. And he, in fact, is telling Democrats that they need to make Christianity more front and center to what they're doing. And he specifically talks about Frederick Douglass and Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King and Reinhold Niebuhr and this kind of long tradition of Christian social activists, and says the Democrats can draw on this really rich and vibrant tradition. And of course, during the primary, he's running against Hillary Clinton, who is a good old-fashioned social gospel Methodist who is also a very devout Christian, but she didn't want to talk about it. And he thought that was a mistake. And he says repeatedly this is a mistake, that Democrats need to claim Christianity for themselves as well and not allow Republicans to pretend like they're the only folks who understand what true Christianity is. And I think ultimately Obama failed, that he wasn't as successful as he wanted to. I think he would probably say he wasn't as successful as he wanted to be in pushing the Democrats this way. But certainly this continuous debate among Democrats of how do we balance Josh's point of supporting pluralism and saying we're not going to make policy decisions on the basis of our faith, while at the same time saying we're going to affirm the real faith of people and recognize that, especially in today's world, many Black voters, many Latino voters do take their faith very seriously, much more so than perhaps majorities of white voters. And so the Democratic Party is still wrestling with how to do that.
Yeah, it's my understanding, and I certainly could be wrong, but from what last time I looked at it, immigrants in general in America are very religious. Not necessarily all Christian, but okay. So even majority Christian then immigration. So it's like, and I remember we interviewed a guy who had written a book called something
Migrant God.
No, it's something in the Lamb. It was Sam Rodriguez. He was a big, I don't know if I guess MAGA, I don't know, but he's definitely super like in those conservative circles and talking and all that. But he would years ago, and he was saying, look, just understand, guys, Latin Americans are Christian by majority, and they're going to be coming in this country, and you want to appeal to them because to appeal to them, you need to be Christian. You need to have Christian values to appeal to them because they are by and large Christian, and they make up 20% of the population. So, and it will only increase. And so, well, I guess Trump's trying to stop that. But anyway, we're not talking about that right now. We've talked about that a lot. So here's my last kind of question, and then we'll get to like just kind of you selling yourself and your book and all that stuff. Stuff you love doing as a scholar and a historian. Yeah. So there are three factions you talk about. Three kind of coalitions, big, maybe streams, whatever you want to say right now, right? Yeah. In this contemporary moment, and they're contending for the vision of the nation's future. What are those? Describe that for me, for our audience.
Certainly
what you mean by that.
Yeah, certainly this is an oversimplification, but because I bring the book up to the present, and also, the question I get most asked, and I have throughout my career, is like, where do we go next? And, I didn't study history to predict the future. We can leave that to the apocalyptic premillennialists. But nevertheless, I had to kind of take a stab at it. And so we all know, we've all been reading the data. I know you both have been about, declining religious adherence, declining numbers of self-identified Christians, the rise of the nones. But nevertheless, it's clear that our politics is still extraordinarily infused by religion. And I kind of joke about, the religious right is the gift that keeps on giving me to my career, because I keep trying to have to explain this and where its historical precedents come from. But in doing that, when I end the book, the way I see things now is that there are basically these three coalitions. There are conservatives, kind of Trump Christians, and it's not just Trump. We could also, be more broad, George W. Bush types, who want to reinfuse their vision of Christianity on American public life. And in many cases, the current Supreme Court seems to be very sympathetic to those arguments. So coming back to a 19th century idea that this is going to be a predominantly Christian, and the nuance today is it wouldn't be predominantly Protestant. They do mean Christian more broadly than they would have in the 19th century. And so it's going to be conservative Protestants, politically conservative Protestants, as well as Latter-day Saints, as well as conservative Catholics, who are all building this coalition to try to make sure that Christianity is the continuing dominant form in the United States. And they're on the defensive. They know they're on the defensive. They recognize that the demographics of the country are changing. And so they're, it's kind of a last gasp or the hope for revival. Second group would be the folks we were just talking about, those social gospel, more progressive folks, the Obamas, the people who think Christianity does matter, and it doesn't just have to be Christianity, but faith matters, in that people should be allowed to bring their faith into the public square, and we want to create room for that. We want to create mechanisms for pluralism to thrive, where people don't ever have to feel ashamed or embarrassed about identifying as religious, but that we also, in doing that, need to recognize that we are a diverse, pluralistic nation, and so we need to find ways for that to happen. And then there's the third group, which is the kind of hardcore separationists who say, no, you need to keep Christianity in the closet, not Christianity. You need to keep your religious faith in the closet, and that it doesn't matter what you believe, but you need to shut up about it in the public sphere. And that's the one, the kind of the Bill Maher's of the world. And I have the least patience for that one. You probably know over the course of this conversation, I'm in the middle with the pluralism folks who say, no, it's not right to ask religious people to not be religious, but at the same time, they need to recognize the realities of a very diverse country and think about how we can support each other in our shared goals while also recognizing diversity and difference and uniqueness.
Yeah, I really like that. And it definitely, I think our focus is going to need, I heard this countless times on the show, it has to become more localized in the sense of like, hey, let's just care for our neighbors and let's figure out like how we're going to make our city better and, you know, kind of our county better. Like even state, that's too huge, right? I mean, obviously you gotta focus in on some of that stuff, but it's like, as we're moving forward, like I said it today in a story, like half the country voted differently than you. So they're still going to be here, by the way. And okay, so just imagine they're not going to be here in 3 years. What does that mean? How's that going to happen? 90 million people not here. What my point is that's absurd. They're going to be here. If they weren't, that would be a tragedy and like a horrific, apocalyptic kind of event that would make it so that they're not. And we don't want that, whether we're MAGA or woke or not, we don't want that, right? So what is it? We need to learn how to live with each other. They're going to still be here. We can't deport everyone you don't like. Sorry, guys, that's not how it works. Anyway, sorry, that was a little jab at my MAGA friends. So how can people get the book? Sorry, Matt, you can reply to any of that. I was on a little bit of a, what do you call it, soapbox there?
Yeah, so I mean, the way you get all your books. So, you know, whatever website you like, you can get it. It's available March 3rd, so it'll be available. It's also available in an audiobook. I was wondering when we were finishing production on this if we were going to get to the point where robots were going to read it, but no, it's actually a really excellent audiobook.
Nice.
Specialist who's got a great voice, and the publisher, Basic Books, let me kind of choose among a number of auditions. So that's wonderful. And then, of course, the ebook too. But yeah, it was a fun book to write. I hope people will find it useful for explaining this moment. I mean, that's why I love history, is to think about what we can learn from the past. And for me, it creates a little bit of a humility in recognizing that as much as I like to think I have all the answers, so has every generation before me. And so I try not to be super prescriptive about what we ought to be doing going forward, but at the same time, recognizing like there are always those voices who are calling for more peace and more justice and more righteousness. And I'm trying to learn from them in my own life, and history helps me do that.
That's really good. I really appreciate it. Matt, thank you so much for being on the program with us.
Thank you, guys. This was a lot of fun, and I'm sorry if I talk too fast. That's just the old Californian in me. But
it was great. I absolutely loved it. And to our viewers and our listeners, guys, Jane, thanks for our watchers and our listeners. Thanks for joining us. And guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.